really.
So let's go to the following speaker. Will be Amzat. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Yes, Amzat is.
Thank you. I think it is important to give to our friends from Asia a short focus on the Russia-Ukraine crisis from a Pan-African perspective, because Asia must be aware of what is going on today in Africa. The Ukraine-Russia crisis is a case study for Africa in the search for a new foreign policy based on the protection of African lives at home and abroad. When the Russian intervention started in Ukraine, we saw African students being arrested by Ukrainian police borders or being refused from entering the neighboring countries. This situation underlines the rising anti-Black racism and far-right policies in some places of Eastern Europe. Western propaganda said that African students could be pro-Russian mercenaries or that they should enroll with Ukrainian troops for Ukraine liberty. Unarmed and peaceful African students were treated like illegal criminals and war prisoners. Ukrainian airspace was closed, but you can be sure that if it was a war going on in Africa, the Western countries would get no difficulty to break any no-fly zone to rescue their own citizens. Countries like Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, or Tanzania succeeded in evacuating their people. From Germany, Austria, France, or Belgium, some African diaspora networks organized crowdfundings and driving expeditions to get some students out of Ukraine. This dramatic event is part of the story of the 21st century Pan-African movement, and we truly see it as a victory because African lives were saved from the Ukrainian war. Pan-Africanism is a global, social, cultural, and political movement that promotes solidarity among Africa and African diaspora. Thus, saving African lives and Black lives out of Africa is important because we are integrated in the world historical landscape by slavery and colonialism, but the color of our skin is still not integrated at the global level. Thus, we are still fighting for African dignity, and the international relation is a battlefield for African dignity. From the African perspectives, the self-centered Western media and politics give to the Ukraine crisis much more attention than the one given to similar crises in Africa. Media will always use pejorative terms when they speak of African crisis, had a much more respectable vocabulary concerning Ukraine, and they started to speak of Russia as if it was an African country. For instance, some French TV analysts explained that Ukrainians should be welcome because they are not like African and Syrian, because they are educated and prosperous people who drive the same cause as French people. Next point is about the diplomatic perspectives. In the last years, European Union imposed strategic partnerships to Africa, leading a pro-French policy in its own countries. Senegal's president and currently chair of African Union, Macky Sall, condemned Russia's invasion in the name of the respect of international law, territorial integrity, and national independence of Ukraine. But Senegal and half of the African countries did not vote the first UN resolution. The speech of Ukraine President Zelensky at the African Union changed nothing, and there is no expected African boycott of the next Russia-Africa summit because the world is changing. For Africa, the implication of NATO, US, and European Union in Ukraine crisis reminds the NATO-EU-led military campaign that destroyed Libya, killed Gaddafi, and caused dramatic consequences, including the destabilization of Mali. African countries called for Pax Africana, that is African solution to African problems in Libya, and they do the same for Ukraine. The idea that Africans should stay out of Western conflict was expressed for the first time at the 1900 Pan-African Conference in London. A resolution called Africans to stay neutral in the war that was opposing British and Boers in South Africa. Even the participation of African soldiers to the two world wars was made through coercion. Black soldiers felt that they were fighting abroad for freedoms that they were denied at home. Thus, African neutrality is also linked to the fact that the two world wars started with the escalating European conflict to a global level, including and calling for the African mobilization. Concerning the vulnerability of Africa to food crisis, food dependency to Russia is a sign of the neoliberal turn of the Russian economy. In the Soviet period, food production was strictly balanced to match with consumption. Because of its socialist system that was not based on overproduction, Russia could not operate a large economic assistance to African countries that would be competing with the so-called aid coming from the free market economic capitalist Western countries. A lesson of Ukraine-Russia crisis is that feeding the world is part of the global economic war. When some food cargoes were allowed to leave, we heard that most of them were going to Europe or Middle East, while the propaganda was about starvation in Africa. It means that the war on food is not for the well-being of the people, but for the benefit of the market. From the African perspective, food crisis in Africa is not the result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but a consequence of the African underdevelopment. We never decolonized the colonial economic system that forced Africa to produce raw resources like cocoa, cotton, coffee for the capitalist system, and some former French colonies still use a colonial monetary. In return, Africa became dependent upon the importation of food, and when the import was interfered with by war or any other eventuality, the people could suffer famine. A last point is the new African bourgeoisie and middle class who is addicted to foreign products. Now, I would like to give a few words about the French-Russia confrontation. French President Emmanuel Macron was the president of the European Union from January to June, and we must connect Ukraine and Mali crisis. The most widely shared photo is probably the meeting of French and Russian presidents in Moscow around the longest table in history. In West and Central African countries, demonstrations were also led by youth waving Russian flags. Some French officials said that the youth were paid by Moscow, but it is not really the issue because French also paid people to wave French flags. This is about war propaganda. The turning point is that in the 2 last years in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, some young soldiers took power. You must know that the military is a social force which is open to all contradiction. Military can be revolutionary, reactionary, or reformist, depending upon other factors. Most of African military regime are authoritarian, but the most progressive and popular African leader, a military from Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara, who led an anti-imperialist revolution before he was killed in 1987 by a French-led operation, is inspiring African youth today. And for them, the most convincing and popular decision of sovereignty is to end French military cooperation, which was a failure, and to engage a new relationship with Russia. And Sergei Lavrov was in Bamako yesterday to sign this new partnership. In reaction, France and a group of West African countries led by Ivory Coast decided to put sanctions to Bamako regime. In a speech in Benin, Emmanuel Macron also explained that Russia is the last imperial power and that he could not understand that Africa, with such a colonial legacy, could not understand the Russia's colonial intervention in Ukraine and the threats of a Russian colonialism in Africa. Indeed, African experience with colonization by France, UK, Spain, or Portugal, or Belgium led us to believe that colonialism and empire is only related to overseas expansion. However, colonial domination over land, with one state colonizing its neighbors, is the model which prevailed throughout Central and Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th century, and this model was linked to the expansion of the capitalist system that also put Russia as an economic dependence of France and Germany before the Russian Revolution, like China was also placed under economic war in the 19th century. Imperialism is not only the acquisition of a classic colonial empire, but the formation of a powerful national monopolistic system under the dominance of finance capital. So the case is about global and financial imperialism over Africa. And France is part of the problem. And the question is, will Asia be part of the problem or the solution? It is also an imperialist competition for African strategic natural resources, and an era of imperialist wars that is going on today in Ukraine, in Venezuela, or in Mali, with the Western world trying to prevent its fall. And we need the Bandung spirit to address this issue. The US State Department issued an act to target groups and peoples that would promote Russian influence in Africa. More and more people think that those pressures to make Africans change their mind could be counterproductive because we have around 20% countries in the world that are living under sanction. Those countries are getting closer to one another and they can benefit from the victimhood narrative. From Moscow, economic sanctions imposed to Russian banking system could impact Russia-Africa trade, but it also encouraged the search for a multipolar economic and monetary system, including cryptocurrency, that is along with African attempts to end the colonial monetary system. Thus, we are in a time when we should turn difficulties into opportunities. In the case of Africa, countries are searching for comparative advantages with different actors, including Asian countries. Broadly speaking, the military benefit could be with Russia or the US. The economic interest would be with China. The cultural side would be with the so-called Western world. And in the meantime, we have a Pan-African rising movement that wants Africa for Africans. In conclusion, I would say that we are working as Pan-African organization to identify every possible crisis going on in the world and to evaluate the changing relations to Africa and African diaspora. African youth wants to write their own story, and this is why they need to read a new Pan-African history, including the connection between Asian and African nationalist leaders, and to be trained by a new generation of African intellectuals, especially historians. When we speak of fake news, African youth also need a new generation of scientists to decolonize the fundamental conditioning nature of Western technology that is used currently in the popular mobilization. In one of my books, I speak of a 2012 report of the French Ministry of War, saying that Pan-Africanism is giving pride to African youth and the Pan-African feeling could endanger French interest or Western interest in Africa. From Pan-African feelings, French started to speak of anti-French feeling because they refused to change their colonial mindset. Indeed, some African youth stand today with Russia, also because of the Franco-Russian confrontation in Africa is opening a new scope for a rising Africa along a rising Asia. Turning Pan-Africanism into an anti-Western movement to drive France out of Africa is not new, because Pan-Africanism was born out of African resistance in the Americas and Caribbean, but the issue is not about the pro-Russia or the pro-Ukraine African position. Africa, with more than 50 divided countries, is at the crossroads of antagonist foreign powers who have their own agenda. The COVID-19 and Ukraine are two crises that we should take to write a new Pan-African narrative. Thus, Africa could defend a united position on the Ukraine-Russia crisis and see which country out of Africa, especially in Asia, could follow the African position. Thank you.